Okay, hi everyone. So today we're talking about dispositional explanations. So another way in which we explain how and why people obey. So we've spoken before about the agentic state and legitimacy of authority, situational variables from Milgram, proximity, location, uniform. Today we're talking about personality. So internal factors that make someone more obedient or less. The main research we're talking about today comes from Adorno. So as you can see here, it's lovely Adorno. He was really interested in why people with strict parents from a very traditional background are more likely to obey. So some key terms that we need. The first is what a dispositional explanation is. So it's highlighting the importance of personality. Now what you would do in these essays, if you had a question that said outline and explain one or more explanations of obedience, you could talk about this. Say how actually personality plays a role, or actually no, it's situational, it's proximity, location, uniform, and then you could critique it. Well, actually no, it's legitimacy of authority, it's who you see as an authority figure that makes you more or less likely to obey. And so Adorno was focused more on authoritarianism, so being very strict in your views, very traditional, conservative, and these people are more likely to obey authority figures. So in this instance, who is more likely to be obedient is going to be the nurse. Characteristics that make them more obedient, well, they wear a uniform, the location that they work is important, proximity to other authority figures, and more than likely they're not rule breakers, they're somebody who obeys the law because they're in a good profession, whereas the criminal obviously hasn't. So this authoritarian personality then, extreme respect for authority. People who don't fit into their beliefs are weak. We should have powerful leaders, traditional values, a love of country, a love of family. Things are too soft. We should be going back to how they were. And this strong sense of conservative viewpoints and a total disregard of people who don't fit into that view make these people more likely to obey. They're inflexible on their outlook, a dislike for those of what they would say inferior social status. So people who are of a different sexuality, people who are a different ethnic group, they would argue are weaker and responsible for all of the bad things in society, is what they would believe. So where does this come from? And he had an answer for that too. He said that it's childhood that creates this personality type. Strict parents who are really harsh, high standards, very critical of any mistakes or any failings that you may have, creates hostility and resentment in the child. So they can't express that towards their parents, therefore they displace that onto other people who they perceive as weak. So this is very much a psychodynamic explanation. focusing predominantly on displacement. So, harsh parents, you then resent them, can't take it out on them, so it becomes displaced onto people you think are weaker. I hope that makes sense. The F scale you have in your book. Now, the F scale was how he decided or how he quantified this personality type. So it's called the fascism scale, and it's seeing how conservative and how traditional you are in your beliefs. And that was his way of measuring the authoritarian personality. So if you scored over a certain amount, you would be deemed to be authoritarian, and he would say you're more likely to then obey authority. Now, it's incredibly shocking, the F scale, because there are questions in there, as you will see in your booklet, that are not socially acceptable. We have to remember this was the 50s, it was a whole different time, there were different beliefs, different, criminal prosecutions for things like homosexuality. So we take it with a pinch of salt and we critique it. But for him, this was how he measured that personality type. So Adorno sample, 2,000 middle-class white Americans. So your job was to read up on how Adorno created the F scale in the textbook. He developed the F scale, the fascism scale. They were measuring unconscious attitudes towards racial groups, and found that people with authoritarian leanings identified with strong people, or who they perceived to be strong. And this harsh parenting created these children who were very obedient to authority. So a good recap for you to do once you've made the notes. What is the AP? Where did it come from? How did it originate? What was the F scale? All good questions to practice with each other. And then we can talk about AO3. So lots to unpick here. Not many strengths, a lot of limitations. Our first strength, however, does come from Milgram. So he pops up again within this section. We see him in situational variables and his shock experiment. And our strength is that we've got supporting evidence for the authoritarian personality in the 60s. So Milgram and his friend Alan Elms conducted interviews with a sample of 20 obedient participants from Milgram's original study in the 60s, 64. So what he did was he rounded back up the people that he used, his sample, for the original study. He gave them the F scale to complete, and those that scored highly on the F scale also were those who were most obedient. So hopefully you can see here we've got correlational evidence. Just because they scored high on the F scale and they went to the full 450 volts doesn't mean that these two things coincide, that one caused the other. Okay, so we've got a strength, it does support it, it's showing that in one of our most famous obedience experiments, these people also were scoring highly on the F scale. However, the participants, also had unusual traits like not liking their father and no extreme punishment in childhood. So when Milgram was doing interviews, he would say to them, how was your childhood relationship with your mum and your dad? And we would expect harsh parenting. We would expect punishment, because if you're authoritarian and have that personality type, you also have that strict upbringing, which he didn't find. So we've got a strength and a limitation in one. So it's hard to link the two, it's hard to generalise, and it's correlational. Okay, that's our first. So secondly, here we have a limited explanation. So you can't argue, if we take Nazi Germany as an example here, we would expect the followers of Hitler to have authoritarian personalities, because they are trusting, they are obeying a charismatic leader, somebody like Hitler, who managed to get a whole group, a whole population to follow his orders or follow his beliefs. So we would assume they would have that personality type. However, we can't say that is true. Not all German citizens in World War II were anti-Semitic and all shared the same personality type. So what we can't do, what this explanation doesn't do, is explain racist fixed views. It can't be generalised to everybody who has a racist, homophobic viewpoint. So this is a massive limitation for Adorno's theory, the lack of generalisation, and actually something called the social identity theory might actually explain it better, where a person's sense of who they are depends on the groups to which they belong. So you almost create your identity based on the people that you associate with. So if you are somebody who is a racist or a homophobe, you tend to find I imagine they tend to find like-minded people, and that becomes part of their identity. So therefore, social identity is better than Adorno's theory of this personality type. And the personality type is limited. It's not realistic, it's not generalisable, which is a big problem. to fit into what Adorno believes. So researcher bias, self-report, difficult to then generalise. Okay, then what I've got here for you to do, practice some AO2 for research methods using the worksheet that I've got in the book. Have a look at practicing some of your research method skills. Try not to cheat, here are the answers. And then I've just got a link in there that you can watch and how it links to part of the F scale.